This is the Earth Science Classroom. Welcome back to the channel. This video is going to detail every single biogeochemical cycle that we have on this planet, or the 5 major ones, which includes the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, the sulfur cycle, and the phosphorus cycle, and how these cycles are moved and transferred and translocated through the Earth's system, through the atmosphere, through the oceans, through the terrestrial biomes, both the biomass and soil and rock layers, and through the Earth's crust. This is the Earth Science Classroom. Our planet is a system. It's classified as an open system because of the exchange of energy and matter between space and our planet and the atmosphere and everything else within the planetary system. So, biogeochemical cycles are a great example of matter being cycled and moved around within a planetary system to aid the existence of life on this planet. So in terms of systems, there are sinks and reservoirs, which are basically the same thing, which means that the matter or energy is going to stay in one place and be stored for a given time or period. And this is called residence time. It could be a very short time in a matter of seconds or minutes, or could be a very long time in terms of hundreds of millions of years, especially when talking about the rocks and rock cycle. Then we have the term flux, which is a word that means the movement between, how things connect, and the transfer of matter or energy between 2 or more sinks. Now this flux could be in any direction and also have an amount that is associated with how much is moving in that flux between certain reservoirs or sinks. So the system is built upon this movement and storage of matter and energy flowing around in a cycle. And this is how we look at the biogeochemical cycles in regards to sinks, reservoirs, and fluxes, to understand how much of each part is staying in one area or one location and for how long, and how it is transferred and moved between sinks and reservoirs. So biogeochemical cycles are fundamental to Earth's biosphere and the circulation and movement and transfer of key chemicals and nutrients between all different spheres of our planet, including the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, the cryosphere, and the anthrosphere, which is the human element. Now, all these combine to create our planet as a system, and these key chemicals and elements are continuously being cycled between each part and component of our planetary system. Now, the amount of nutrients and chemicals and elements within this system is finite to a certain extent. We do have the addition of some elements and chemicals from asteroids and meteorites that come in from space and do make contact and impact with our planet. However, the majority of these biogeochemical cycles are of a finite amount within our planetary system. Now, they can be stored and not able to be retrieved for many years, which is residence time in terms of the rock cycle, and carbon, for example, being buried deep in the rock layers, and this would take a long time to cycle. However, you do have this continuous motion of elements and chemicals if you consider a very large time span. Now, these biogeochemical cycles include the following: carbon, water, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Now, the first 4 are the main 4. Sulfur is important, but generally the first 4 are very common. And the water cycle is extremely important because of the connections between all the spheres and the ability to increase the movement of other chemical cycles like the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle. And it's important to consider the connection and collaboration between both the biotic components of the planet, which is the living organisms, and the abiotic, which is the non-living component, the rocks, the water, the soil, the gas in the atmosphere, how all of these play a role in assisting the cycling of these biogeochemical cycles to combine to form this amazing planetary ecosystem and biosphere. The water cycle is one of 5 biogeochemical cycles that exist and operate on Earth with the main purpose of sustaining life on this planet, the biosphere. However, the water cycle goes far beyond just sustaining life. It was the origin of life through the ancient oceans. It is involved in tectonics. It is involved in the atmosphere with the creation of weather and climates and extreme weather. It is related to the wind, which is linked to the temperature differences on the planet and low and high pressure. It is involved with the creation and destruction of landforms and geomorphology. It is involved with the rock cycle. It is involved with volcanic eruptions. So the water cycle is an integral part of the entire planet and how it functions. Water is a chemically beautiful molecule in terms of its presence on Earth, its sheer abundance on Earth, and its existence in all 3 states of matter on our planet at one time, and the changes and phase changes between all 3 constantly throughout the water cycle. So its frozen component is ice, its liquid component is water, and its gas component is vapor, and that is based upon the addition or removal of chemical bonds between the elements based on the amount of thermal energy added to the molecule, which can be linked to the latitude, linked to climate, linked to weather, and also linked to the location of the water. So this is an important part to consider when discussing the water cycle. So in regards to the water cycle, we got to discuss the cycle as a system, and the system has the inputs and outputs. In this case, it has the pool or sink or reservoir being that storage where the water is going to be held for a given time, and that given time is referred to residence time, or RT. So this could be a long period of time in terms of the Earth's history. It could be in the hundreds of millions of years or thousands of years, or it could be a very short time in terms of a few days or even minutes. And then we have the flux. We have the connection and the transference of that water in different states of matter, in different amounts, different time periods, between the sinks or between the pools, and we can analyze how this is moved to understand the whole system and how it works and connects. So in terms of the flux or the fluxes, that is the movement and transfer of the water between the storage areas. Firstly, for the water cycle, we're going to consider the main pools or reservoirs or storage areas where water is held for a given time. And this can fluctuate based on the type of sink or pool. But we have 100% of water on this planet, of which 97% is held or stored within our planet's oceans. So the salt water or saline water, and that equates to about 3.5% salt concentration by weight, and this is where the majority of the water is stored between the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian, Arctic, and Southern Oceans, and any seas that are also connected and associated with each ocean basin. Then the other 3% of water that exists on Earth is split between various storage or pools with varying residence times. First one is any land or surface-based water being held or in the ground or crust or soil or sea floor, and this is all termed terrestrial. And this is a small part, so about 0.9% is groundwater, and about 2.1% is held in the ice caps, the glaciers around Antarctica, around Greenland, around the northern hemisphere, in areas like Canada and Russia, Siberia, Alaska, and also the sea ice that forms over the winter in the northern hemisphere over the Arctic C. A small amount is held in soil in terms of rivers and stream flow, organisms, and any kind of lakes or ponds. Then the other storage area or pool or sink is the atmosphere in terms of the water vapor and any liquid water held within the clouds through condensation. And this is a very small amount, and it also does not stay in this pool for very long, so you have a very short residence time compared to an extremely long residence time in the oceans and a varying time within the terrestrial pools and reservoirs. The majority of our water cycle can be summed up with the oceans and how 97% of the Earth's water is stored or held for a given time in our oceans, and how the oceans then start the large cycle and movement of water between various spheres and across non-ocean surfaces, being the terrestrial component, which includes groundwater, ice caps, rivers and stream flow and soil moisture and permafrost, and also lakes and rivers and organisms, both flora and fauna. So these are included in the fluxes, how water is moved through different states of matter, different amounts, different times between the areas and storage pools and reservoirs, including the oceans across our planet. In this water cycle diagram, we're going to start in the oceans, which is where the majority, or 97% of the Earth's water, is stored in this reservoir or pool as salt or saline water. So we have upwelling, where the water is being moved up towards the surface. Downwelling is from the surface down to the lower or deeper parts of the ocean. And this circulation in the surface, middle, and deeper parts of the ocean, or benthic, is caused by differences in temperature, density, and salinity. So any water that is going to be heated, and it's the first phase change whereby you have evaporation going from water to water vapor and latent heat. The energy is stored within the molecules of the water vapor, and as it rises up to a higher altitude within the troposphere, the first layer of the atmosphere, the temperature is going to drop due to adiabatic cooling. Now this will cause another phase change where the water vapor is going to turn back into liquid water and condense, which is condensation, at a LCL or a dew point, and form liquid water and water vapor in the clouds. The clouds will move through wind and changes in pressure and weather systems and climate, and based on latitude, and this is called advection. Then we have precip over any terrestrial land masses, and we have the addition of water on land, different types of precip, and we also have the addition of water vapor going straight back from snow and ice and glaciers, which is called sublimation, which is where you have intense heating and the ice would turn straight into gas and miss out the middle phase change, which is liquid. Then we also have the interception of any precip before it hits the ground by any vegetation, most likely trees or shrubs or bushes, again based on the biome and based on the latitude. You also have the addition of water vapor coming off the land, which is called evaporation, or if there is evaporation of any flora or vegetation, we call this transpiration. So you combine both, you get evapotranspiration. Then we have the addition of fresh water from precip on the land, which is going to shape the land, which is weather and erosion, and transport sediments within the water. You're going to have stream flow and rivers flowing downhill with gravity. You have the accumulation of water on land through any impervious surfaces or bedrock, which is the creation of lakes and ponds, and maybe even small cases in puddles. You have the effect of temperature on the water on land, which is going to be melting or freezing. And then you have the water, which is going to flow over the terrestrial surface, the relief, the terrain, and affect the geomorphology, and also flow into the soil, which is called infiltration, and then percolation through the soil and create soil moisture. Any kind of porosity in the soil and bedrock, you'll have water flowing through with gravity into these spaces and air pockets and voids, and you'll create groundwater and groundwater flow with gravity, which is expressed in the water table being the highest point below the surface, and any large accumulations of water are called aquifers. Any additional water that is from precip that flows over land is called surface runoff or overland flow, which is an addition to stream flow or stream water. So you add in the different fluxes, the movement of water between the three main pools or reservoirs, which are the oceans, the atmosphere, and the terrestrial component of the earth, and how water is moved between all three as a very large cycle, and how this cycle is connected and linked with the other biogeochemical cycles. For example, the leaching and percolation will move both nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur through the soil, will aid in assimilation. The water cycle will link up with the rock cycle and create weather and erosion and depositional environments of new sediment in different areas, forming new landscapes. The rise and recession of the tides, erosion of coastlines, the rising of sea levels to submerge or expose more land around the planet, the expansion and retreat of glaciers and ice caps based on the climate and based on any kind of extinction events of any life on Earth. So the water cycle is so influential in everything that the Earth does. Every mechanism, every process, every system is going to include water in some capacity. So for the carbon cycle, there are 5 major carbon sinks or carbon reservoirs or carbon pools where the carbon is stored for a certain amount of time. Now each storage or each pool is different in its characteristic, in size, and also how long the carbon is stored in that particular pool or reservoir. So the first one is the lithosphere. It's the upper mantle and crust. It is the rocky layers towards the surface of the planet which contains the majority of the carbon. This is also held in fossil fuels, in which we extract and burn to obtain energy through the hydrocarbons, which will obviously add additional carbon back into the system, which would have normally been held for a long time within this lithospheric pool or reservoir. Then we have the global oceans as a carbon sink, and how carbon is diffused and dissolved into the ocean water, the salt water, and held there, where there are various chemical reactions to either hold the carbon within the ocean or to move the carbon from the ocean back into the atmosphere or back into the lithosphere. Then we have the soil. Soil is a carbon sink. It is a smaller size sink compared to the lithosphere and the oceans. However, soil plays an integral part of holding the carbon and moving the carbon not only into the biomass but also back into the lithosphere, and also in runoff and erosion back into the oceans. Then we have the atmosphere contains CO2 gas, even though it's a very small percentage, around 0.04%. Currently, the atmosphere plays an important role of moving that carbon from storage or from flux, from pool to pool or reservoir to reservoir. And finally, the 5th pool or reservoir is the biomass, the vegetation, the flora and fauna, the animals and plants that contain the carbon not only in themselves as part of their cells and their actual physical makeup, but you have the movement of carbon through the biomass, through the vegetation and the animals, into the soil, into the atmosphere and the oceans. On Earth, the majority of the carbon is stored in the lithosphere, which includes the upper mantle and the crust, layers of rock, which also includes metamorphic and igneous rocks. However, the focus and where the carbon is mostly stored is in the sedimentary rocks, which forms from the accumulation of sediments in certain environments through burial and sedimentation and various processes that take those sediments, glue them together basically, push them together and bury them into layers based on geologic principles, and they form eventually sedimentary rocks, which the main ones are the carbonate minerals, which form certain sedimentary rocks like limestone and dolostone, and if the limestone is further compressed and heated, it will turn into marble, which is metamorphic. But the main rocks are sedimentary, and this is where the majority of the carbon is stored through the carbonate mineral group within those sedimentary rocks. And the cycling of this carbon, so the main carbon storage sink is the rock layers, and once it's there, it can be then transferred and allocated through the system, through the cycle, through the soil, through the biomass, through the atmosphere, and eventually also through the oceans, and then back into the rocks through a term called calcification and sedimentation, the forming of sedimentary rocks. But the main principle here is that the carbon is starting in the rock layers as the main source, the main abundant volume of carbon, and then transferred within the other carbon sinks throughout the Earth's spheres and then back into the rocks as that completed cycle. After the lithosphere, the oceans are the second biggest carbon sink or reservoir or pool on the planet or within the system, and it plays an important role in cycling and moving the CO2 between various spheres and to maintain the influx of CO2 back into the lithosphere. CO2 enters the ocean through dissolved gases from the atmosphere and a little bit from the incoming stream flow rivers off the land into the water, into the oceans. From there, the CO2 is going to react with water, H2O, and form various chemical compounds within the ocean. For example, you have carbonic acid, H2CO3, and bicarbonate ions, which is HCO3 negative. These can dissociate or react in the ocean. So if they dissociate, you'd release free hydrogen ions, which would then lower the pH of the oceans to less alkali to a more acidic, which is called ocean acidification. And you also release a free carbonate ion, which the carbonate ion will react with the incoming calcium, which is coming from the weather and erosion of rocks through water as an erosional agent and transportation, and arrive in the oceans from that source. And the calcium would react with the CO3 negative and form CaCO3, which is calcium carbonate. Now, this is the main cycle of carbon that's going to go back from the oceans into the lithosphere, and this is called calcification. So what happens is the CaCO3 is used by animals, marine animals, to build their shells and their skeletons or exoskeletons, and once those animals die, they're going to fall down to the bottom of the ocean floor and accumulate along the ocean floor. The animals will die and decay, and what's left is the calcium carbonate shells, which are going to be buried, accumulate under heat and pressure, and this is called calcification, and this would eventually turn into lithification of forming various sedimentary rocks such as limestone and dolostone. And the cycle of carbon from outside the oceans, from the atmosphere or the terrestrial sources, will go through the ocean, through this process, and go back into the sedimentary rocks to be stored for a long time as a carbon storage. Rocks can also erode and be weathered on the ocean floor and re-release the carbon back into the oceans. So you have the presence of both dissolved organic carbon through the marine animals and the use of the carbon through their shells to form calcium carbonate shells, and you also have the DIC, which is dissolved inorganic carbon, which is basically the CO2 reacting with the bicarbonate, the carbonate, and the carbonic acid to form different compounds within the ocean without any kind of biological influence. So the animals, the biological influence would be called a biological pump, which is used to balance the system and to maintain the movement and flux of CO2, of the carbon, through the ocean system. You also have physical pumps, which are basically the circulation of the ocean through downwelling and upwelling and ocean currents, that's going to move the carbon through different compounds and molecules around the ocean to eventually form the calcium carbonate and be pumped out through the biological component to form calcification. Our next carbon sink is soils, and soils play a vital role in transferring the carbon into both the biomass and to circulate it back into the lithosphere, back into the atmosphere, and eventually also through weather and erosion and soil erosion and water going back into the oceans. So the soil contains carbon through organic material or organic matter, so SOM, and this can be between 10 to 30% of the soil could be made up from organic material, both in the topsoil, which includes the O and the A horizon. And this would be from the decomposition of organic material, the biomass, and also the transfer of carbon through the breakdown of rocks and minerals, which form the basis for soil. That can occur through percolation of water, the breaking down through chemical weathering of the minerals, and the leaching of nutrients and carbon from the topsoil down to the subsoil, the B and C horizons, for uptake through plant roots and nodules. So this organic material, SOM, could also be called humus or detritus and leaf litter, and it can vary greatly based on the biome, the ecosystem, the climate, the amount of precipitation the soil receives, and the amount of organic material in terms of the organisms in order to turn over the soil, in terms of the soil type, the amount of clay, silt and sand that is in the soil, which would then help to retain the water and retain the essential nutrients, the cation exchange capacity, which is basically going to impact the amount of carbon that can be exchanged and taken by the plants to use for growth. And then we can discuss the interaction with biomass, the vegetation, the flora and fauna, and the storage of carbon through the plants and animals that exist on land. The key transfer for vegetation flora is the uptake of CO2 in the use of photosynthesis, to take the gas with the sunlight and convert it within the plants, within the leaves and the chloroplasts, to usable sugars and glucose for the vegetation to use as fuel. And also the respiration of animals and fauna respiring out CO2 back into the atmosphere. The last carbon sink or pool or reservoir has to be discussed is the atmosphere. Now, the atmosphere has a very small quantity of carbon in the CO2 gas. This equates to 0.04% of the atmosphere in total. The atmosphere is composed of mostly nitrogen and then a small part of oxygen and a little part of argon, and CO2 is one of those trace gases, those greenhouse gases that exist in the atmosphere as a limiting factor in terms of the small amount. However, if it changes by a small degree, it's going to have a large impact on the system, both in the influx of CO2 in the oceans and also with the biomass in regards to photosynthesis. The next discussion is the human impact, the anthropogenic impact of this cycle in terms of the addition or removal of CO2 from the cycle, in terms of the balance, the natural pumps that work both in the biomass, the soil, the rock layers, and of course the oceans, and how the excess CO2 from various human processes and activities will account for a change in the system, which we see mostly in the atmosphere and the oceans as a key indicator of the changes of CO2. For example, you add more CO2 in the atmosphere, you'll get a naturally more dissolved CO2 in the oceans, and that will cause a higher amount of free hydrogens to be produced through dissolution, through the chemical reactions, and that would then lower the pH of the oceans. This has happened over the last 150 years, where there has been a slight lowering and acidification of the oceans, which has a great impact on the ecosystems that exist in the oceans as a careful balance. When you imbalance or remove that balance of CO2, going to have an adverse effect on the ecosystems that exist in the oceans. Also, you might have an impact on the biomass. However, if we continue deforestation, we continue the removal, extraction and combustion of fossil fuels, releasing all of that carbon that's stored in the sedimentary rocks and the influx of CO2 into the atmosphere, this is a positive feedback loop where you're just removing the carbon sinks but adding more carbon in a flux, so it has to go somewhere. So the human element is very important to consider with the carbon cycle and every biogeochemical cycle on the Earth. The chemistry of nitrogen is absolutely fascinating because the majority of nitrogen on the planet is held in the reservoir or sink, which is the atmosphere, which is around 78% nitrogen, which is an inert gas. It doesn't really chemically react with many gases or elements, or is not easily reactive. So this element is going through different changes throughout the cycle, chemically through different areas of the planet, mostly involving microorganisms and microbial activity whilst or when it gets into the soil, and how it is converted and changed into different nitrogen compounds involving both oxygen, carbon and hydrogen. This element is fantastic in terms of its importance for life and how it cycles through our planet. There are three main processes that occur to nitrogen throughout this cycle on Earth. The first one is nitrogen fixation, the acquirement of nitrogen as a gas and fixing it or taking it or putting it into a different environment and changing its chemistry into a compound, then further changing this compound through what's called nitrification, and finally to remove certain elements from that nitrogen compound to make it go back into nitrogen as a gas, which is called denitrification. So these chemical reactions can either be oxidation, which is the addition of oxygen, which can also mean the removal of hydrogen, and this would involve a loss of an electron or electrons, which will make it a cation, which is a positive charge because you are removing an electron, therefore there's more protons than electrons in that atom, making it positive charge. In reverse, we also have a reduction chemical reaction or process whereby the nitrogen compound is removing an oxygen or adding a hydrogen, which would then gain electrons, which will make it an anion or negative charge because you're adding more free electrons to the nitrogen compound, and that would make more electrons versus protons, making it a negative charge. So the chemistry of nitrogen is fascinating in how it changes between organic nitrogen and inorganic nitrogen. And in reference to organic nitrogen, that is where it is derived or comes from or is sourced from organic matter, or you add a carbon element to the mix. The nitrogen cycle will start here in the atmosphere. The atmosphere contains three main gases: argon, oxygen and nitrogen. Argon is about 0.9%, oxygen about 20.8%, and nitrogen about 78%. And nitrogen occurs as N2 in the atmosphere as a gas, which means that there's two atoms bonded together through the electrons, and this is a very strong bond, and it's called a triple bond. So this is an inert gas. It doesn't really react with any other elements or gases in the atmosphere. It has to have extra energy in order to react chemically, and in terms of the nitrogen cycle, it has to be changed and added to make a larger nitrogen compound in order to be useful for biomass, useful for the ecosystem, and useful for plants in terms of nutrient and macronutrient uptake. Now, in terms of macronutrients, this is a large amount of nitrogen that is required by vegetation on Earth in order to sustain life and growth. Now, nitrogen is a key part of the biomass requirements, and therefore it is important to understand where the majority of nitrogen comes from, which is the atmosphere. In order to access the large quantity of nitrogen as gas in the atmosphere, it has to be fixated. And this means that it's taken from the atmosphere, there is movement from that sphere into the oceans or terrestrial geosphere, and in terms of the biosphere, in terms of bacteria. Now, these microorganisms act as a transfer machine of acquiring this gas from the atmosphere, nitrogen, and physically and chemically changing the nitrogen into a larger compound which can be used then by plants and biomass. Now, this occurs in the soil around the A horizon, which is in the topsoil, which is usually below a very thin O horizon. So this bacterial activity comes in two different types. There's free living bacteria, which is bacteria that hangs out in the soil by itself and does a job of taking that nitrogen and converting it into mostly ammonia. And there's also symbiotic bacteria, which actually works with plants and root nodules, and they kind of like nestle and hang out on the roots of plants in the soil, and they work with the plant to actively take the nitrogen, convert it into ammonia, and that would then start the process of allowing the plant to uptake this source of nitrogen, because the gas N2 cannot be obtained or absorbed or uptaken by any biomass on the geosphere. So basically any plants can't use this gas, it has to be changed first, and these bacterial masses in the soil, both free living by itself or attached to plant roots or root nodules, are going to do this job for it, like a factory of taking in the raw materials, which is the gas, and changing it into a usable product, which is going to be the ammonia, which is NH3. Or we could have chemical or man-made addition of nitrogen, which can happen through what's called the Haber-Bosch technique, which is where you have nitrogen gas plus hydrogen at very high temperatures, and it creates a artificial or synthetic nitrogen which can be used as fertilizer, and it kind of revolutionized the fertilizer industry for agriculture back in the early 1900s, and has been used ever since to increase the amount of nitrogen, because once humans realized that nitrogen was a key ingredient in plant growth and plant health and soil fertility and soil health, that's when we realized we can artificially increase the amount of nitrogen through this technique to increase the yield and growth of our crops and plants. And finally, we have a natural, very quick addition of nitrogen, which is going to be lightning when it hits the ground, so cloud to ground lightning. You also have precip and rain and overland flow taking nitrogen from the A horizon, which is very close to the surface, and washing it to other areas via gravity. And we also have the addition of nitrogen through organic waste, through human and animal waste will add in extra nitrogen. So there's three main ways: biological through bacteria, chemical through man-made, and atmospheric through this addition of nitrogen. Now the nitrogen is in the soil, in the A horizon, is being converted and transferred into different nitrogen compounds, firstly ammonia, NH3, by the three methods mentioned earlier. Now this is nitrification, the process of changing and becoming larger nitrogen compounds through the addition of either oxygen or hydrogen through bacterial activity. Now nitrites, which is NO2 minus or negative, is the next step in nitrification. So basically you're going to take the nitrogen and add in the oxygen. So you have oxidation or oxidizing. Then we have further oxidation, which means to add another oxygen element or atom to the mix, to the compound, which makes nitrates. Now nitrates are very important because this is the compound that will most easily be absorbed and uptaken or used as food by plants through the roots in the soil and uptake through the plant, and this is used as the food, the protein. It's used in various plant processes and mechanisms for growth, in terms of photosynthesis, in terms of proteins, amino acids, and also the health of the plant as well, not only the growth but the health. And then further, if you add more hydrogen to ammonia, you get ammonium, which is process of ammonification, which again can be used through the plants as food, but the most common is nitrates, NO3 negative. And these are used both with the bacteria on the roots, which is symbiotic, or mostly with the free living bacteria, which is cyanobacteria, which is responsible for the oxidation. An important part of the nitrogen cycle is called assimilation. This is the term used for when the plant uptakes the nitrogen compounds, mostly nitrates and some ammonium, and uses that nitrogen for various functions and processes within the plant, namely growth and health of the plant. And this is the part where the plant, in addition to other macronutrients and micronutrients, create photosynthesis through the chlorophyll and the chloroplasts and produce the growth of vegetation, which then forms the basis for all food webs, food chains, ecosystems, biomes, and environments, and how both the biotic and abiotic combine together to form the beautiful living planet that we experience. So the process of assimilation is very important in how these root nodules and these bacterial types, both free living and symbiotic, are used to take the nitrogen in the soil, the nitrates and ammonium, and transport and pass this macronutrient, which is required in very large quantities, into the plant for its functions. Now, there's a lot more organic chemistry involved in the actual bacteria and how they transfer the nitrogen from the soil into the plants, when the plants use it inside its roots and inside the plant. Now, if you want to learn more about the actual bacteria and how they chemically transfer and move the nitrogen compounds into the roots, I'm sure there are other videos and other textbooks and journals that will describe the complexities of organic chemistry with these bacteria. But in this case, in this video, it's just the understanding and appreciation that both nitrates and ammonium are assimilated from the soil, from that abiotic component, and moved through the bacteria, through the nodules, into the biotic component, which is the plants. So far, we discussed the fixation of atmospheric nitrogen, the gas, into the soil, into the top layer of the soil, the A horizon, through bacterial and microorganisms and microbial activity, and transferring that gas into organic and inorganic compounds of nitrogen, namely ammonia first, NH3, then nitrates and nitrites, and ammonium, and how the plant is going to use mostly nitrates as their food source and plant growth and photosynthesis and to gain biomass. However, the cycle is a cycle because there is movement from the soil, from that nitrogen compounds, back into the gas form of nitrogen, which is N2, back into the atmosphere. Now, this is done through certain bacteria called Pseudomonas bacteria. And these are bacteria that reduce the compound, which means to remove or take away the oxygen or hydrogen from that compound, just to release the single nitrogen, and it's going to combine with other nitrogen in the atmosphere, and again that triple bond, making it very strong, so it stays there and is retained in the atmosphere due to the chemical bonding of these elements. So therefore, bacteria play an extremely important role, not only in the acquisition and change of nitrogen, but also of the removal of nitrogen from the soil to maintain the balance. Obviously, too much of one thing will create an imbalance and not keep the soil and the plants and atmosphere at an equilibrium. It will bring the system out of balance. So these are also important to put the nitrogen back into the atmosphere. Any working system is made up of smaller components that work together. One of these small components in the nitrogen cycle is involved with decomposers. The organic matter which is decomposing within the soil, which is humus, and this can contain leaf litter, can contain organisms that is dead and decaying flesh or matter, and the nutrients from the organic material is going to be broken down by bacteria and fungi and actively removed from the matter and put back into the soil. Now, there are two terms that are important. There's mineralization, which is the process of taking organic nitrogen and turn it into inorganic nitrogen. So the organic comes from that dead and decaying material, and you make it into nitrates or ammonium or ammonia, inorganic, or the opposite term, which is immobilization, which will be to take the inorganic nitrogen, the nitrates or ammonia, and convert it or add in carbon to make it organic nitrogen. So the two terms work together to either change it from organic to inorganic or vice versa within the soil. And again, the plants can use this as additional nitrogen for assimilation. Or bacteria will work on these new compounds and remove through reduction and allow the nitrogen to go back into the atmosphere. So the cycle between the creation of nitrogen compounds, the loss of nitrogen compounds for it to go back into the atmosphere, or the internal movement of organic to inorganic happens as well between mineralization and immobilization. Here is a cycle in its entirety, which includes both the nitrogen fixation from the atmosphere into the soil, the activity of bacteria throughout the whole system within the soil, both to assimilate, both to fixate, to change nitrogen, which is nitrification, and also to remove nitrogen, which is denitrification, back in the atmosphere. And we can also add in both the cycling of organic to inorganic and vice versa, which is mineralization and immobilization, and obviously include the presence of vegetation and the biomass, which is going to use that changed nitrogen for plant growth and plant function. But you can also add in the impact and changes that occur to the cycle due to human activity, most commonly through the burning and consumption of fossil fuels through cars, transportation, factories, industries, and also the natural element of volcanoes. Any eruptions will add additional nitrogen in the atmosphere as well. The element sulfur has a mass of 32 and it has 16 electrons and 16 protons, and it has 23 different isotopes, and it has 4 stable isotopes, being 32, 33, 34, and 36. But the main one we're looking at is the sulfur 32, or 16, the one we get on the periodic table. And this element is highly reactive. Not only does it react with other elements to make compounds and mixtures, but also it has a range of oxidation states from -2 to +6, so 8 different states. So it is highly reactive, and it comes in different variations in the cycle. You have the basic elementary sulfur, you've got sulfur dioxide, SO2, sulfate, SO4 2-, and hydrogen sulfide, H2S, and the last one, sulfuric acid, H2SO4. And these come in different quantities around the cycle. And one of the unique traits of sulfur is its yellow coloring of the element, and also its unique smell, which is like rotten eggs. Sulfur has 5 main sinks or pools or reservoirs. The first is the lithosphere, second is the ocean, third is soil, fourth is the atmosphere, and fifth is biomass. Now, in terms of quantities, the lithosphere is by far the majority holder or storage of sulfur in the cycle. Then comes the ocean, then comes soil and biomass, and last but not least is the atmosphere. Our sulfur cycle begins in the majority or the largest quantity of sulfur in the sink or reservoir, which is the lithosphere, the upper mantle and the crust, both the ocean floor and the terrestrial continents. The majority of the sulfur is held or stored in evaporite rocks and sedimentary rocks, mostly ocean sediments and deposits, and these turn into both limestone, dolostone, and gypsum in various stages of lithification and sedimentation on the ocean floor. Now, how this gets there is through both the oceans and also through weather and erosion on terrestrial surfaces to then re-enter through the oceans. And the main storage of sulfur is the sulfate mineral group, which comes in two varieties: sulfides, S2, and sulfates is SO4 negative. And once you have the storage of sulfur in the rocks, you have tectonic uplift, bringing rocks to the surface to then be weathered and eroded through the elements, and also carried up through magmatic material to eventually be released through volcanism on the Earth's surface, both on the continents, through volcanoes, and through deep sea ocean floor hydrothermal vents called black smokers. The oceans play a vital role in the storage and the flux of sulfur within the sulfur cycle, and the addition of sulfur into the oceans comes through direct deposition or fallout from the atmosphere. You also get dissolved sulfate from the atmosphere into the oceans as SO4 negative. You also get the dissolved and the deposition of DMS, dimethyl sulfide, and you also have the addition of any sulfur that's been broken down through chemical weathering and erosion of any terrestrial minerals or rocks containing sulfur that are going to flow back into the oceans through any kind of stream flow, groundwater flow, or any kind of surface runoff. So the uplift and the climate are going to dictate the amount of weathering and erosion that takes place. Also, you get soil leaching. It's going to take the sulfur back into the groundwater and eventually back into the oceans. So once it's in the oceans, we have this inorganic sulfur being actively taken by phytoplankton, by bacteria, and converted into organic sulfur. And these microscopic animals will then produce hydrogen sulfide as a waste product, which would then be used by chemosynthesis or chemoautotrophs on the ocean floor to create their own food and sugars without the presence of sunlight. So they would add in the CO2 and oxygen into the H2S, which is hydrogen sulfide, and create their own energy and food. Then you also have the deposition of organic and inorganic sulfur through dead and decaying animals in the ocean, and inorganic through hydrogen sulfide being deposited onto the ocean floor and forming sedimentation to go back into the sulfides and sulfates and the sedimentary rocks and form sedimentary rocks. And you also have the addition of dissolved water with sulfur in subduction zones, taking the dissolved water and bringing it down with subducting slabs and plates deep down into the mantle, where it will be melted and rejoin the rock cycle as magma, but containing sulfur as one of the volatiles, the gas component of magma. The atmosphere plays an important role in moving and transferring as a flux sulfur throughout the cycle. It's not the biggest sink or pool. It's mainly just to have chemical reactions within sulfur's gas form, which includes some gases such as sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, carbon disulfide, carboxyl sulfide, dimethyl sulfide, last but not least, sulfuric acid. Now, it all starts with both COS and SO2. Now, these are the more common gases in the atmosphere in terms of percent weight. Now, sulfur gets into the atmosphere through the dissolved sulfur in DMSP being released through bacteria as DMS, and the sulfur being released by soils, which is called volatilization. Now, human activity plays a vital role in the sulfur cycle in regards to any combustion of fossil fuels and hydrocarbons that will contain sulfur, and this is released in the atmosphere as a potentially harmful pollutant, and you get sulfuric acid, which is a secondary pollutant, which is basically means that the sulfur is there but then reacts with extra elements and molecules in the atmosphere to create a different molecule, in this case sulfuric acid, which really puts the acid in acid rain and lowers the pH. So wherever it is deposited or precipitates this sulfuric acid, it's going to affect the ecosystem, affect the ecology, affect the chemistry of both the oceans and the soil and the land, and basically cause damage to the environment. So this has been a hot topic for many decades. But you have the oxidized sulfur dioxide can go into hydrogen sulfide, which can then go into the oceans and be deposited. You can also get direct what's called fallout or deposition of that sulfur from the atmosphere into both the soils and also the oceans. And this is called both wet and dry deposition. Now, as listed, a lot of these gases are released not only from the soils, but also from the decay of organic material, or it is oxidation from a certain present gas, or it is also from the release of bacteria and algae, both from the oceans and the soil, as a waste product to then recycle this sulfur into the system. The soil and the biomass are an important sink or pool for sulfur. As with the other biogeochemical cycles like nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, and the water cycle, including the sulfur, you have this cycle of nutrients that are key to the growth and health and existence of the biosphere, of any living flora and fauna. Any organic compounds, organic matter is going to be utilizing sulfur in various quantities to promote growth and health. For example, in trees, the leaves, the chloroplasts, which are in the chlorophyll, which is used in photosynthesis, is going to use sulfur to stay healthy and maintain that function of taking sunlight and adding oxygen and CO2 and producing glucose and sugars for growth, which is a vital part of our ecosystem. And then it also is involved in the effectiveness of nitrogen metabolism through the roots and legumes in the soil. So organic sulfur and the production of organic sulfur is critical in the soil, mainly the topsoil, the O and the A horizon, for the ability for biomass to maintain growth and health within the ecosystem. Now, how does this organic compounds of sulfur get there? Well, you have to assimilate from inorganic compounds, which are going to be from the weather and erosion of rocks and sulfur and sulfate mineral group elements and rocks and minerals. And that will be there as the storage for the bacteria to then assimilate the inorganic sulfur into organic sulfur, which means to really add carbon. And you also have the ability for the plants then to assimilate this organic carbon in the form of phosphates, which is SO4 negative, which is the main type of sulfur used or taken up by the biomass. You can also get inorganic compounds coming from weather and erosion of the surface rocks and the movement of sulfur through the water cycle to then be deposited in different areas to and add to the topsoil the amount of sulfur. So you have this chemical reaction, either reduction to remove the oxygen or oxidation to add oxygen into phosphate to create this organic sulfur in which the biomass is going to utilize. So in general, the sulfur cycle is the transportation and modification of sulfur from the inorganic compounds through the sedimentary rocks, through sedimentation, through ocean deposits, and converting this into organic compounds within the soil for sulfate uptake of plants, or through uplift and the release of sulfur through volcanism into the atmosphere, also through weather and erosion, and the release of sulfur through soil volatilization, and the combination of both hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon within the atmosphere to produce different sulfur compounds and different sulfur mixtures, in which will be deposited, and which is called fallout, into both the soil, back into the biomass, and also into the oceans in terms of dissolved sulfate and also DMS, dimethyl sulfide, and how this dissolved sulfur is going to be used by the phytoplankton in the oceans, as it is also used as by the bacteria in the soils, and be converted from inorganic back into organic, and then back into inorganic again as waste in terms of hydrogen sulfide. And this will be again recycled into the ocean floor as deposition, both in terms of decomposing matter and inorganic sulfur, back into the sedimentation and back again to complete the cycle within the sedimentary rock layers of the lithosphere, which is the upper mantle and the crust. So the cycling of sulfur is not only important for the oceanic ecosystems and marine life, but also in terms of terrestrial ecosystems and flora and fauna, in terms of the soil health, in terms of soil quality, in terms of the amount of sulfate that can be uptaken or used or assimilated by plants, vegetation, and the constant cycling of sulfur through sulfur dioxide and COS in the atmosphere, through volcanism and large tectonic activity in terms of a larger, longer timescale. And the combination of sulfur with nitrogen, with the water cycle, and also the carbon cycle is absolutely intriguing. The element phosphorus has an atomic number of 15. It has 15 electrons, 15 protons, and a mass of about 30.9. And this element is 11th most abundant in the crust as a mineral, and it is an integral element for all biomass, vegetation, flora, for growth, and the backbone of both DNA and RNA. So plants and vegetation require this element, but it is also a limiting factor because it exists in small quantities. If the quantity is too high or too low, it can affect the growth and quality of vegetation and the soil. And phosphorus comes in different variations chemically in the cycle. It exists as the phosphate ion, PO43 negative, the hydrogen phosphate, HPO42 negative, dihydrogen phosphate, which is H2PO4, and phosphoric or phosphorus acid, which is H3 or H4PO4. Again, these are all variations of phosphorus when you are adding hydrogen and oxygen to the basic element. And this occurs when the phosphorus is reacting with water. The phosphorus cycle is linked closely to the other biogeochemical cycles, especially the nitrogen cycle, which includes also sulfur, the water, and the carbon cycles. Now, they all have their major storage areas in the Earth's system called sinks or pools or reservoirs. Now, in terms of the phosphorus cycle, it is the lithosphere or the marine sediments with more detail. It has the oceans, the soil, and biomass. It does not have the atmosphere. Now, there is a small, very small quantity and flux of phosphorus that is moved through the gaseous layer of the Earth, the atmosphere, through perhaps sea spray or dust or maybe some pollen. But the idea of a sink or pool is a large quantity of stored elements or nutrients, and the phosphorus cycle just doesn't have that quantity to have the atmosphere as one of those sinks or pools. And it's the only one of the biogeochemical cycles that doesn't involve in a large capacity the atmosphere. We begin our cycle for phosphorus in the oceanic sediments, the deposits of large amounts of phosphorus, the largest sink in the cycle, and how this phosphorus actually gets to the ocean sediments. So obviously you have an ocean above it, which is going to provide and deposit and accumulate through a burial flux the amount of phosphorus required to then go through diagenesis to form these deposits in marine sediments and eventually into sedimentary rock layers through diagenesis and lithification, and then eventually through uplift into the soils and the surface where it can be re-weathered and eroded, and water playing a major role, the water cycle, in the movement of phosphorus through the erosional agent of water, which is very powerful, through the stream flow, through groundwater, through lakes, rivers, and ponds, and eventually back into the ocean as that influx of phosphorus, mostly as the phosphate ion. Now, in the ocean itself, you have these phytoplankton, these microscopic animals in the base of the food chain in the marine food webs. And this is in a eutrophic zone where it is close to the surface in the photic zone, and you have this primary production going on with photosynthesis with the phytoplankton, and they're going to consume this inorganic phosphorus in terms of phosphate ions. And it's going to serve as a biological pump in the oceans where the phytoplankton is going to consume and uptake the phosphate ions. It's going to be organic phosphorus in these marine organisms. When they decay and decompose and they fall to the bottom out of the eutrophic zone onto the benthic zone of the ocean and accumulate on the ocean floor, there you have that large amount of phosphorus in the organic material that's decomposing. Also, the waste out of the phytoplankton is going to add additional phosphate into the system, and this is going to accumulate as oceanic sediment deposits. A vital part of the phosphorus cycle is the uptake and assimilation of phosphorus or phosphate ions into vegetation, into the flora, into the plants, the grasses, to provide the terrestrial ecosystems with that producer and that nutrients that's integral for the plant growth, the plant biomass, for DNA, RNA, and for general health of vegetation. So this is done again through bacteria and microorganisms in the soil, in the topsoil and the B horizon, and also maybe the C horizon with extensive leaching. Now the water cycle plays an important role in percolation and leaching of cations and anions and colloids and humus and organic material which contains the phosphorus, and also inorganic phosphorus which comes in H2PO4 and HPO42 negative, which is dihydrogen phosphate and hydrogen phosphate. And collectively they are called orthophosphates in terms of their ability for the plants to uptake this type of phosphate compound. So these are both inorganic. So a lot of the chemical cycles and the plants are going to uptake organic nutrients or organic versions of the chemical or the chemistry. And in terms of phosphorus, this is going to bind with soil and be uptaken by the plants. The phosphorus cycle is similar to other biogeochemical cycles like the nitrogen cycle and the water cycle, carbon cycle, and also sulfur cycle that have or can be impacted by humans and human activity. Now, in terms of the phosphorus cycle, phosphorus being a limiting factor and very important in the growth and maintenance of crops and plants and farmland and the whole business and industry of agriculture and producing food to feed the world's population, phosphorus plays an important role in farming and farming practices and the application of extra phosphorus onto farmland in or through the application of fertilizers, as with nitrogen, can play an important role in the cycle, in the balance of this very small but very important chemical or nutrient, which is phosphorus. Now, the addition of phosphorus is down to soil erosion and providing more security on the crops and the crop yield from season to season. However, runoff and erosion can play an important role on the excess phosphorus into other water sources, like lakes and oceans, and cause eutrophication. So looking at the phosphorus cycle as an entire complete cycle involving the biomass, the soil, the ocean and marine sediments, the rock layers with sedimentary rock, and also the oceans. Each sink is accounted for, and the major fluxes of movement of the phosphorus are stated, and also in terms of the type of phosphate or phosphorus in regards to the chemical compound, the addition of oxygen and hydrogen, the removal of oxygen and hydrogen to change the variety within the cycle, both inorganic and organic forms of phosphorus which includes the process of mineralization and immobilization between bacteria, and the bacteria are basically PSB, which is phosphate solubilizing bacteria or phosphate solubilizing microorganisms. And you can also include in this the uplift of the rock layers, which is mostly going to be the phosphate mineral group, which contains about 300 minerals, and the main mineral with phosphorus, about 95%, is apatite. And the role of the water cycle is inherently important with the movement and flux of phosphorus and the absence of the major atmospheric quantity or sink within this cycle, but most of it is done through the overland flow, the stream flow, the groundwater flow between the ocean, the rock, and the soil, and the ability for water to transport phosphorus around the soil through leaching and percolation. And you have to also include the large quantities of phosphorus being added by fertilizers on agricultural and arable land across the world, because farmers are using this to kind of guarantee the growth and yield of their crops rather than leaving it up to nature. And as it's a small quantity and a small limiting factor nutrient, phosphorus is important. They add it in the fertilizer to guarantee more growth. But then you do have the consequence of excess phosphorus flowing through with the water, with the erosional agent, into bodies of water, causing various environmental issues like eutrophication and algae bloom, because the algae is going to eat the excess phosphorus and exponentially grow in numbers, which is called a bloom, which can then take away the oxygen in the marine environments, whether it be a lake or ocean, and cause issues for the food web and food chain because of the lack of oxygen and the anoxic environments. This is the Earth Science Classroom. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, please subscribe, like, and share. And if you want more content and videos on Earth Science, please check out my channel.